I'm sorry I'm a moment late today. I won't say that it won't happen again. What I do need to do is to talk about the administration of the rest of the class. And next Monday, I need to see your art projects here. Please bring your art projects here. Then on Tuesday and Thursday of next week, I hope to hold extra office hours so that you can come and show me your artworks individually. That is not a compelled activity. I simply couldn't manage to cope with 700 art projects. It is, however, a desired activity, and I'd like to see as many as possible. What must become obvious to all of you is that, unlike some classes, this class includes a large amount of voluntary work on your part. If you enjoy the voluntary work, you're learning something. I simply cannot force you to do the art projects. That must be obvious any more than I could force you to do the masks. I simply implore you. What I can force you to do is the final paper and the examination. And I might exert a little bit of force majeure. On Friday, we hope to be able to hand back almost all the papers, certainly the papers that were handed in on time for the light-hearted schema, and some of them have retained a wonderful buoyancy. Rosalie terribly wants me to read one of them to you. Perhaps I should. I haven't seen it, because she found it rather than I. And it's called, I'm told I should put on a Chicago accent. A brief history of poodleism, as witnessed by Sergeant Saturday Detective Art Division. Monday, Sept. 11, 1975. The fat man holding the poodle had terror in his eyes. He hugged the small, frightened animal closer to his chest as he ranted. "You've got to stop this madness," he said. "He almost got poor Fifi. I saw him. He shot this little dart at her and would have hit her if my little son Bobby hadn't got in the way." I took the dart from him. Sure enough, it looked just like the ones used in the other poodle shootings. "Is little Bobby okay?" I asked. I think so. I'm not sure. I haven't really checked since I pulled the dart out of his leg." "Yes, sir. Very good. I'll have the department call you as soon as we know anything." I examined the dart closely as I drove home. The man had reason to be afraid. There had been a bizarre string of poodle killings in the last month. At first glance, they seemed like your average everyday string of poodle killings. But then I started to dig deeper. Over the same time period, a new art form had made its debut on the artistic scene. Perfect two-dimensional replicas of poodles had been appearing at auctions and going for fantastic prices. I suspected a connection, and I knew that it must lie in whatever was in these darts. Wednesday, September 12th. "I'm glad you brought this to me," said Professor Fogfart. "There's something very interesting about it." I was in the Tiemann Labs, UC Santa Cruz, the laboratory of Professor Winston P. Fogfart, noted biologist and geneticist to be exact. I was talking to Prof. Fogfart and his undergrad lab assistant, John Geekley. Prof. Frogfart and Johnny had been examining the liquid in the dart for the last 2 days. They called me earlier this morning to say they'd found something. The material in this dart is a very advanced, very rare 3D to 2D topological DNA helix alteration compound, said Prof. Frogfart. Just as I'd thought, I said, which means, of course, exactly, said Johnny. Any creature injected with it has its 3-dimensional DNA coding reduced to its 2-dimensional topological equivalent, thus causing it to flatten lengthwise into a 2-dimensional replica of its former self, which, of course, slowly and horribly kills the poor creature injected, I said. Prof. Frogfart, who could obtain such a thing? That is the frightening part, he said. The only known research going on in this area is being conducted right here at UC Santa Cruz. Very interesting, I said. I had a suspicion. Call it a hunch. I knew where I had to go next. Thursday, September 14th, I was backstage at the weekly Santa Cruz art exhibit and auction, which was due to start in just a few minutes. I was talking to the auctioneer. He had a French accent. I didn't trust him. Why, no, he said. We have no real way of tracing any of the artists who put their work up for the sale here. Many of the artists like to remain anonymous. So we do most of our deals in cash, and the artists are often not even seen. Even if I did not know of the person whom you are seeking, I could not breach his trust by revealing his name. What if I told you that the poodle replicas being sold here recently weren't works of art, but were really dead, squashed poodles? Then I would probably vomit. Then I guess I won't tell you that. Is this one of them there poodle works? I asked, pointing to a 2-dimensional poodle in one of the many displays. Yes, that is one of the works. That particular one will be going up for sale today, as a matter of fact. Have they all been side views like this, or have there been front views as well? No, they have all been the side views. Is that important? It may be, I said. It just may be. I'd found what I needed to know. Now I was sure. Friday, September 15th. I was back in the biology lab at UC Santa Cruz. It was late and it was dark and I was hiding. The rest of the campus was partying, but I knew where Johnny would be. He clicked on the light as he came into the lab. I could see the dead poodle in his arms. It was just starting to harden and compress. I leapt out from behind the centrifuge and yelled, "Freeze, Geekly!" as I leveled my 4.4 Magnum at it. He yelled, "I give up, but don't shoot." As he dropped the poodle, it made a dull thud as it hit the lab floor. "How did you know it was me?" he shrieked. "It could have been anyone in the building." There was no way you could have known from a purely theoretical standpoint that all those poodles would have flattened lengthwise. A topological genetical DNA 3D mapping has an equal chance of occurring along any axis. No one would know that they'd all flattened into side views unless he were either the auctioneer or the artist himself. Why'd you do it, Geekly? Was it money, fame, the Goyles, the better credit rating? No, he screamed. It was to fulfill a breadth requirement. I have to take this damned art history class to fulfill my humanities requirement. And how were you able to follow all that scientific double talk? You're a lousy criminal law and artistic expressionism double major. I had to take breadth requirements too, punk. Now, come on, let's go. Epilogue. Johnny was convicted of malicious poodle mutilation and sentenced to 3 years of community service at the Santa Cruz Animal Shelter. He later changed his major to philosophy and did his thesis on the unalienable rights of sub-intelligent canines of French derivation.
as an aside. The breadth requirements at UC Santa Cruz were changed soon after the poodleism incident, so that natural science majors were no longer required to take any art classes. Stock in IBM and Lockheed went up immediately. Well, that was Mr. Tim Miller. Is Mr. Tim Miller present? I think, Mr. Tim Miller, your colleagues would like to be able to recognize your brilliance. I certainly do. It was lovely. I hope I didn't ruin it for you. And while we're talking about this, just one other thing. Somebody picked up a nice folder which had apparently some art history notes in it, which was found near the bottom of the campus. There we are. Well done. Thank you. Now, so we're very nearly home. I want to find out a little bit more about your wishes for the final examination. And we could either divide you into two equal portions and give you one a final examination on the 7th, I think it is, and the other on the 12th. Aren't those the two dates I have? Or we could divide you in two and give a short examination in the first half of the 7th and another short examination in the second half of the 7th. I don't know whether you're applauding that because you like very short examinations, or because there are more opportunities to cheat under those circumstances, or because the real problem is that if I have half of you on the 7th and another half of you on the 12th, the people who do it on the 7th will tell the people who are going to do it on the 12th a great deal about it, which will only confuse the people on the 12th. That I can assure you. What really is your wish? Hands up those who want both on the 7th. Hands up those who prefer to be distinguished, some on the 7th and some on the 12th. Yes, my dear, I do think sometimes minorities have an awful lot to be said for them, don't they? I'll be guided, but I'm not going to tell you yet quite what I intend to do. If I can get some extra sort of guards, I might think about everything on the 7th. Rosalie and Eleanor looking, they're nodding their heads as though, no. Well, anyhow, I'll think about it a little bit longer. Is there anybody in the class who would find it very difficult to make it on the 12th? Well, those people could always do it on the 7th, couldn't they? So that's simple. Ha ha. Mm-hmm. I'll see. The 7th has certain attractions for me because it gets all the thing done. On the other hand, I find it very difficult to get through an even halfway decent test in about half an hour. I think it'd be unmitigated chaos, wouldn't it, Rosalie?
Not necessarily.
Eleanor, it would be unmitigated chaos, wouldn't it? Perhaps that's what you want, is unmitigated chaos. Anyhow, that's what I feared. I want to say one final word, and then we will get down and really do some serious art history. And that is, I want to make perfectly clear to all of you, it's useless, isn't it? Always running away. I want to make clear to you what a substantial paper is, because I clearly didn't make clear what an insubstantial paper was. At least I did, only too clear to some of you. Light-hearted meant insubstantial. A substantial paper is one which is not written in pencil, and my two assistants would be very grateful if you could resume your typewriting. Is that all right? I don't mind, but they have, they're sweet people, but their eyesight isn't all that good, or something. Anyhow, so, and a substantial paper, I think by definition, is somehow rather more than one sheet of paper with, 3 words to a line. I mean, that is a ghostly paper. It isn't even insubstantial. It doesn't really exist. It'll blur away. There are certain other things about a substantial paper. You know, you bring it on yourself. If I have to say, well, a substantial paper is really, in most cases, 5,000 words. You don't want me to say that, do you? No. Well, it isn't. I'm happy to say, but it is, first of all, something which shows some result of some reading. Some result of some reading. Some what is called basic, it isn't really research, but an attempt to get to know something. And then it also should reveal an attempt to think about what you have found out. And then an attempt to shape that into some kind of thesis or argument or shape or plot. And you see what can be done. Mr. Tim Miller can concoct a most beautiful plot, a most exquisitely shaped. Why can't the rest of you do something not totally similar? In your substantial paper, I don't mind if you cast it into fictional form, but I shall mind enormously if you do not take up an art subject. I do not want a discourse upon dentistry or forestry or cooking, unless you really relate it to the finer arts. At the same time, I do not wish you to hide in desperate dullness and start off Picasso was born in 1884, partly because Picasso wasn't born in 1884. But chiefly because I know that, or I can find it out. And it's a bore, and you know that the rest of the paper is likely to be a bore if it starts off in that fashion. You've no excuse for being boring. You've no excuse for merely copying something out of some kind of wretched encyclopedia. Exert yourselves. The topic is up to you, but I do not wish for any more papers on Leonardo or Raphael or Rembrandt. Our period starts about the death of Rembrandt. So those of you who are planning to write me a paper on Rembrandt, you have to write a paper on Rembrandt and Picasso, or Rembrandt and Van Gogh, or Rembrandt and J.L. David, which would be rather complicated. Or Rembrandt and Sir Joshua Reynolds, which is an absolute natural. Do you get the idea, chums? I'm not a vengeful creature. You will probably get away with it if you do something which is disastrous and foolish. But why be disastrous and foolish when you have the opportunity to be intelligent, clever, and sensible? Don't spit on yourselves, darlings. Don't spit on yourselves. And even more, and I now say it quite openly and clearly, please do not spit on me. I mean, even if you don't respect yourselves, respect your revered and ancient and about to collapse teacher. And respect my charming staff. All right, we can have the screen down and we can give up all that silly administration. But remember, art projects on Monday. Sweetie girl, thank you for leaving before it goes down. Yes?
Would you be adverse to me showing you my project at your office hours today?
Please, I'm trying to think. Okay. Now then, could we have the lights down too, please? I'm starting off with a somewhat dull painting, but I think it's quite interesting. And it really goes to some extent with the music. And let me just say one or two things about the music, perhaps first of all. It was not an opera on a Scottish theme, but it was a piece of Berlioz. And Berlioz was a great romantic, a musician. He really corresponds in the world of music to Delacroix in the world of painting. And his dates are, roughly speaking, similar. And Berlioz, you should read about, he wrote a marvelous set of memoirs, and he was an outrageous personality of great fascination. He also was very, very interesting because, technically speaking, he was very different from almost all the composers of the 18th and 18th century and his predecessors. He did not play the piano. And that makes an enormous amount of difference to the way you compose. And it is actually the case that Delacroix, that Berlioz is often talked about as a person who introduces a new level of colorism into music. And that, of course, relates him to Delacroix in terms of painting. And certainly Berlioz loved massed horns. He loved sounding brass. He loved a great deal of timpani. And the sort of ti-tum-ti-tum-ti-tum-ti-tum-ti quality, which goes with composing from a keyboard, with your left hand going pom-pom-pom-pom-pom-pom-pom-pom, while your head is going tum-tum-pa-tum-tum, tum-pa-tum-pa-tum. Do you see? That isn't Berlioz. And so there's a new complication in Berlioz. And of course there's a new complication in the whole of 19th century music. And that complication really is something which Berlioz himself indulged in. It is the primacy, probably, in the 19th century in music, not simply of the symphony, but rather of the opera. And Erich Hobsbawm, in his great book on revolutionary Europe, amongst the maps he appends to that book is a map which shows the distribution of opera houses in Europe. Revolutionary Europe, well, as you know, in fact, in Milan, at La Scala, Verdi plotted with his friends, and in Italy, Verdi's operas became, the basis of the political movement of the Risorgimento for many people. They were highly political affairs, and you would plot in the intervals of the opera. Now, the second point really is that the opera was often, just like much painting in the first half of the 19th century, based upon historical themes. And I've forgotten which, is it Donizetti or is it Bellini who writes The Fair Maid of Perth? And is it Donizetti or Bellini or Verdi or Weber who writes Lucia di Lammermoor? The Fair Maid of Perth and Lucia di Lammermoor are both, of course, based upon the novels of a very interesting writer. And perhaps the two key arts of the 19th century are opera and novel writing. And I'm now going to tell you who was the Wizard of the North. And please do not forget who the Wizard of the North was. He was Sir Walter Scott. And people nowadays do not read Sir Walter Scott's novels. But when Waverley burst upon the world about 1810, the world went mad. It went a great deal madder than when Goethe burst The Sorrows of Werther upon the world. It went as mad as any novel has ever made madness in this world. Quite as mad as anybody became mad with Norman Mailer or Thomas Pynchon or, I don't know, who wrote Fanny and Zoe? I've forgotten. Salinger, yes. Madder than the world went over Proust. Madder than the world went over Dostoevsky. Walter Scott was the Wizard of the North. And this painting is a painting by David Wilkie, which records one of the results of the Wizard of the North writing these extraordinary novels, most of which were about Scotland and England, but occasionally some of them about France. It was, of course, there became an absolute Scottish mania. If you want to know when the kilt and when the tartan really entered European consciousness, it was with Sir Walter Scott. And the Prince Regent, when he became George IV, made a special visit to Edinburgh. It was the first time in, a couple of 100 years, since Charles I, actually, that an English monarch had gone to Scotland. Charles made a visit to Scotland in 1633. It was a total disaster. The Prince Regent, padded with immense corsets, wappering his sporran in front of his chubby legs, it depending from his enormous stomach, went to Scotland and was feasted by the canny burghers of Edinburgh, and he put Scotland on the map, so that his niece, Queen Victoria, finally built her own country house at Balmoral. And Scottish things, whether it was Mendelssohn's Fingal Cave Overture, which I played you last time, became enormously popular, and Scott became a European phenomenon. And let's have a look at the next slide, because the next slide just shows us that wizard. And he is, as you can see, wearing a tartan. And the Italians read Scott, and the French read Scott, and the Germans adored Scott, and the English adored Scott, and of course the Scots have never got over Wally Scott. One sometimes wonders that's why they still call themselves Scots. He was an extraordinarily brilliant person. Now, the crucial thing to realize about him was that he did something which had been happening for some time, but he did it on a new scale, in a new way, and it became profoundly important. Walter Scott wrote historical novels. They were not just simply novels about contemporary life. Indeed, they were not novels about contemporary life. They were novels about, many of them were novels about Scotland in the 17th century and the 18th century. But, particularly with Ivanhoe, Scott moved much further. And he raised the level of historical consciousness from that of the rather silly novels of Mrs. Radcliffe and Monk Lewis, the Gothic nightmare tales, to a new level in which Scott attempted to get, for instance, a historical costume right. He attempted to get the names of all the pieces of armor right. He tried to distinguish a 12th century castle from a 13th century castle. And of course, in Ivanhoe, as you know, he depicted the plight of the Jews at Lincoln. So that his historical novels were closely based in a new level of factuality. This move towards the historical novel, which we find in Scott, is then repeated all over the world. In fact, Flaubert does a historical novel based on the Carthaginians, if you please. And, of course, in America, a lot of the novels of Hawthorne are historical novels. And in Italy, the great novel by Alessandro Manzoni, I Promessi Sposi, is set in the 17th century. So that we have to think of the 19th century developing a quite different kind of historical consciousness because of Scott. And amongst those elements is a new sense of the medieval world. And that new sense of the medieval world is enormously important. Let's have a look at the next. We can see that actually in a very early photograph. This is a photograph taken in the 1840s, and it is of the Scott Memorial. And now let's have a look at the next slide, which shows you the Scott Memorial finished. And that Scott Memorial in Edinburgh is, as you can see, a Gothic reliquary in which Sir Walter Scott sits or lies or stands. And you see, it really tells you something very important, that is, there is in fact a Gothic revival. There's a Gothic revival in sculpture, a Gothic revival in architecture, most particularly, but also in some senses a Gothic revival in the visual arts and in the art of history, and it reorganizes a whole notion of European history. The notion of European history for about 3 centuries, from the middle of the 15th century towards the end of the 18th century, had been a notion in which, after all, the really important preliminaries to contemporary life had to do with the Greeks and the Romans. Now what is going on is a notion that the really important events that happened before the present day were not Greece and Rome and the Renaissance, but the great invasions of the Huns, of the Teutons, of the Magyars, of the Jutes, of the Angles, of the Saxons, and indeed, of course, eventually that leads into Celtic revival, and the development of Gothic Europe. And from the late 17th century, late 18th century onwards, there's an entirely new appreciation, for instance, of Gothic cathedrals. There's an entirely new appreciation of Gothic institutions. No sooner is the French Revolution getting rid of chivalry, no sooner the French Revolution is getting rid of the remains of the feudal system, then everybody is beginning to say, but look, the medieval time was a wonderful time. And you can read certain elements of that in a fascinating book by Marc Girouard called The Return to Camelot, which is a book about the 19th century's fascination with the idea of chivalry in so many different aspects. Well, the idea of chivalry, the idea that art, so far from necessarily getting better at the Renaissance, may have got worse at the Renaissance, becomes eventually a very 19th century point of view. And deeper than this, of course, is a reordering of the whole vision of European history, in which you see Parliament becomes important not because of its 17th century activities, but because it is, in fact, a Gothic institution. And, of course, even more important, perhaps, you have to understand that Sir Walter Scott, with his novels about Scotland, really feeds the flames of a grossly growing nationalism. And in Scotland, it is, of course, a nationalism for the Scots. And over again, let me assure you that Sir Walter Scott, of course, breaks into some kind of local idiosyncratic patois. His people start speaking Scots, which, of course, is very, very difficult for readers and for imitators. When they don't speak Scots, they speak quotha and give you goddamn. And that mighty bewildered, they begin to speak 17th century English or 14th century English. You see, there's a whole fresh consciousness. But it is Scotland which is especially valuable for Scots. And then what begins to happen is you see that the Poles begin to produce their national literature, and the Magyars produce their national literature, and even the Flemish begin to produce their national literature. And of course the Germans have been very, very conscious of national literature. J.G. Herder is already deeply interested in the folk and the consciousness of folk. And that, you see, leads to one other thing which is enormously important, is the development of folklore. And from folklore it's one step to the complexity of anthropology. Well, how does this all relate to the visual arts? Well, I want to relate this lecture primarily to painting. And let's go on and start trying to see how that relates. Well, of course, long before Sir Walter Scott, there had been Shakespeare. And in the late 18th century, the passion for Shakespeare increases enormously. And one of the dates that you really should know is the date of Shakespeare's birth, which is 1564, and the first great celebration at Stratford-on-Avon, which is 1764. And 1764 marks the start of bardolatry. And you all know what bardolatry is. It's a blind worship of everything Shakespeare ever did. And that bardolatry, which is Boswell and Garrick to begin with, becomes then an enormously German thing. The Germans decide that Shakespeare was a German, and it was just a misfortune that he wrote in English. Voltaire had only mildly admired Shakespeare. By the end of the 18th century, people like Chateaubriand are recognizing Shakespeare as a very, very great genius. And, of course, painters are painting Shakespearean scenes. And this is a Fuseli, and you can immediately identify the theme. It is Macbeth and Banquo with the three ugly sisters, with the witches. Let's have a look at another. What is happening now? Can you all recognize the scene? Does anybody need? This is not the death of Marat. This is, come on, this is the murder of Duncan by Macbeth. And Macbeth, you know, has just plunged his dagger into Duncan, and Lady Macbeth is saying, now, you know, don't be such a bloody coward. Cheer up, we've done it. We're king and queen. Yummy, yummy. So, obviously, Shakespeare takes you already back into Gothic Scotland. But Scott takes you much more fully into it. And let's have a look at the next, because Delacroix's great central gift is as a poet. Delacroix, who was born in 1798 and died in 1863, and who is the central romantic French painter, and who is enormously important by any account, but who does not reproduce well in slides, and who many of whose paintings I think is very difficult for us deeply to appreciate, was, you see, a passionate lover of music, and a passionate lover of poetry, and a very strange artist in the sense that he ran the gamut from being something very close to a mere illustrator, that is to say, somebody who took a text and then proceeded to embroider it, to an extraordinary colorist and a magnificent composer and a wonderful manipulator of what our art historians call the loaded brush. Well, here we have, quite characteristically, Delacroix, who wrote a wonderful journal which exhibits his great passion for poetry, illustrating the world of Shakespeare. And there are many of his paintings about Shakespeare and about Shakespeare's creatures, about Ophelia. And here we have Hamlet and Horatio. But if Delacroix illustrated, it's the gravedigger's scene, the famous scene you remember, but if Delacroix illustrated Shakespeare, and remember that Verdi wrote also a novel, an opera on Macbeth, and an opera on
Sir John Falstaff and an opera on Othello. Delacroix also illustrated Sir Walter Scott. And here is a famous abduction scene of the fair Jewess Rebecca from Ivanhoe. And as you can see, Delacroix is really an exponent of the Baroque style in many ways. Look at the curving forms, look at the vortices, look at the considerable convolution. On a large scale and on a small scale, you'll also notice that Delacroix is immensely delighted by brilliant oppositions of color, wonderful whites and reds, reds and greens, reds and blue, and his imagination leaps back into the medieval period along with Sir Walter Scott. Of course, Delacroix illustrates other artists. Let's have a next. He does a whole series of lithographs to illustrate Goethe's Faust, which some of you may have been going to see this last week. Have any of you been to see it? It's on the campus. Do you mean to say nobody in this class has any interest in going to... there's somebody. Well, anyhow, Delacroix illustrated Goethe's Faust in a series of lithographs. Amongst others, of course, perhaps the poet that Delacroix was most keen on was Byron, whom you recognize. I showed him once before. And partly because Byron, you see, was a contemporary hero. Partly because Byron wrote about languishing maidens and frightening heroes who were doom-haunted and deeply oppressed by the notion of sin and went in for extraordinary and sometimes rather vicious behavior. And here is a Delacroix illustration of a poem or play by Byron, modeled after Assyrian history. It's the death of Sardanapalus, S-A-R-D-A-N-A-P-U-A-L-U-S, S-A-R-D-A-N-A-P-A-L-U-S, Sardanapalus. And there's a book on Sardanapalus, the death of Sardanapalus, is painting by a man called Jack Spector, S-P-E-C-T-O-R, for those who are interested. Anyhow, as you can see, it's a wonderful opportunity to try to include what people knew about Assyrian civilization, and somehow Assyrian civilization is well represented at this period by elephants' heads. And actually, Sardanapalus himself is modeled upon the growing knowledge of Assyrian art, which is finally revealed, of course, with the explorations of Sir Austin Layard in the 1850s. But more archaeological information is trickling through, and of course, the whole sense of this ancient world is rioted in by Delacroix, because Sardanapalus, deciding that he was defeated, was going to take everything with him. And it's one of the first Götterdämmerung paintings. It ends up with Hitler in the bunker in 1945. But Sardanapalus says, all right, bring all my beautiful harem and kill all those ladies. And here is one of those ladies, a particularly luscious lady, for whom there's a wonderful sketch by Delacroix, being stabbed. And here's another lady who's already had it. And there's another lady, so he had a very large harem. But it isn't only the ladies who are going to get it, it is the horses. And the jewels are going to be piled up, and here are more jewels and drinking cups. And Sardanapalus looks around at the tremendous havoc he has wreaked. Savage, mighty, and nihilistic. And we might begin to recognize that streak of nihilism, which deepens in the 19th century and ends up, of course, with the political nihilists in Russia, and that whole sense of the pointlessness of life and the need for extreme and lavish and luscious and sumptuous expenditure, and, you see, an escape from morality. I think Delacroix feels the incessant pious moralism of the 19th century as something absolutely frightful and disgusting. Won't have anything to do with it. He is a dandy, and dandies don't believe in that kind of morality. Dandies believe in the morality of the individual. Dandies believe in the morality of exquisite clothes. Dandies believe in the morality of reticence, of exquisite and profoundly quiet and haughty manners. The dandy appears when an aristocracy is beginning to tumble.
because the dandy tries to reassert that je m'en fouism, that superiority of the aristocrat. And the dandy, of course, is somebody who cannot bear the bourgeois. So you can see in this painting a great many different stands, and it is dandiacal when you're about to die, to burn all your clothes and all your love letters and leave nothing except a very, very small pile of cinders. So some of you dandies, you might think about that. But of course, Delacroix illustrated many, many different elements of Byron. Byron wrote a poem because he lived in Venice. He wrote a play because he lived in Venice about Marino Faliero, the only doge who was assassinated. And here is Delacroix's picture of the great staircase in the doge's palace and the execution of Marino Faliero, you see. And then Byron wrote, and it's a wonderful poem at the end of his life, a wonderful satirical poem called Don Juan, which is quite the funniest of all the versions of Don Giovanni, and starts off with wonderfully funny seduction scenes. And then Don Juan is in a shipwreck, which is a shipwreck not unlike the Raft of the Medusa. And so in 1840 or so, Delacroix illustrates this latter-day cannibalism and casting of lots on this bleak sea when Don Juan is escaping from Spain and he ends up in Greece. Another illustration to Byron. So Delacroix explores all sorts of different historical periods as he explores, let's have a look at the next, all sorts of different poets and novelists. In 1830, there's a revolution in France, and Delacroix, for once, turns to a contemporary event. And he does Liberty Leading the People on the Barricades, which, of course, commemorates in 1831 the revolution of 1830. And it's often supposed that the man in the top hat is a self-portrait. Once more, you can see Delacroix's Debt to Jericho. The corpses in the foreground are left over from the Raft of the Medusa. Notice another thing, however, that however contemporary Delacroix tries to be, and the top hat and cravat, and the musket, and the little boy with the pistols really are contemporary scenes, and the barricades did exist, and in the background you can see Notre Dame, and if it were better slide, you could see other buildings from the center of Paris, but they are subordinated to an allegorical figure, a historical figure of liberty herself. And I don't think many young women went rushing around Paris in those hot July days saying, my God, it's hot, I'm going to take off my bodice, I'm liberty. But she waves her tricolore, and after this brief inspection of a contemporary scene, Delacroix returns, you see, to exploring the whole of history. And this is so fascinating a one, because who would have thought of doing a painting about the Fourth Crusade? The Fourth Crusade itself was a scandalous affair. It was led by a blind Venetian duke called Enrico Dandolo, who was in his 90s. And this crafty old boy told all the Franks, told all the French and Germans and English, look here, we don't want to go to Palestine first. Look, let's sack Constantinople. I mean, you know, there's millions and millions of dollars worth of gold here, wonderful jewels, and these scurvy Greeks have been behaving very, very badly, and we've got to be paid. And so the Fourth Crusade enters Constantinople. And here are these wonderful, bemused knights on their splendid horses. And here, of course, are the bereft and raped and savaged and assaulted fair Greeks. And elderly parsons pleading for mercy. And the whole of the Bosphorus stretched out behind, you see. And it's a peculiar historical moment. And Delacroix tries to get the costume, roughly speaking, right. He tries to get the penance right. He tries to get our moral better. At the same time, of course, he does magnificent passages of color all through the thing. And Delacroix is a person whose horses never cease from snorting, and whose gents grimace, and whose ladies languish. Right at the end of his life, he explores a completely different historical scene. The historical scene at the time of Augustus, the high moment of the Roman Empire, but seen from the point of view of Ovid, who was a naughty poet whom Augustus eventually banished to live amongst the Scythians. And there is Ovid writing a letter to Augustus saying, can't I come back to Rome because I really don't like ass's milk, of which he had to drink plenty amongst the Scythians. So you see the way in which Delacroix's imagination rolls over vast different areas of history. On the other hand, let's have a look at the next. There is a point that one wants to make, and that is that when Delacroix's historical imagination is ravenous, voracious in the extreme, but his style is undoubtedly entirely post-Renaissance. Here's an early painting which does, in fact, mimic Raphael, an early Delacroix of a Madonna and Child which mimics Raphael. Let's have a look at the next. But of course, Delacroix's great model, he had really about 3 or 4 models. Raphael a bit. Then Veronese a very great deal. Probably a certain amount of Tintoretto. But most important of all, Rubens. And here is a Delacroix hunting scene. Of course, Delacroix loved hunting scenes because they were so violent. And he particularly liked if it wasn't, you know, neat little Europeans in hunting jackets, if it had a nice exotic strain to it. And he did go to North Africa, famous visit in the early 1830s, and there he saw, of course, wilder hunts, and he actually saw lions in action. And here's a marvelous lion in extreme action, and scimitars and turbans and brilliant red capes and so on and so forth, and absolute violence. And that lion is going to make a good meal of somebody, and the hunters are going to make a good meal of the lion, and you're meant to feel this forearm, and you know then it's just like a kind of preliminary version of Jaws, you see. And where did Delacroix get the idea of these hunts from? Let's have a look at the next. Well, of course, Rubens did boar hunts and lion hunts and many, many other kind of hunts. And Delacroix borrows the style of Rubens and borrows the colorism of Rubens and borrows or descends from the subject matter of Rubens. There's nothing wrong with doing that. And when you do a sketch as extraordinary as this, then you're in the business, aren't you? And this is a wonderful, incandescent, violent firework of a painting, about a wonderful firework of a situation. And while the debt to Rubens is great, the freedom of brushstroke, the brilliance of the color, the oppositions of reds and greens, the sense of the actual matière. And remember, I told you that Delacroix was deeply indebted to Constable. Well, I wish I could talk about Delacroix at much greater length. We may return to him in a different context. But the point I want to make about him at the moment is that his style is in no sense medieval. His great contemporary, Ingres, was a much more complicated person in this respect. Ingres was born about 20 years earlier than Delacroix. He was actually born in 1780, and he outlived Delacroix. And he's a fascinating painter whom I cannot deal with in any great detail. What I want to talk to you about is simply his interest in history. And his interest in history, of course, is enormously deep. And here he's doing a painting which shows his deep interest in neoclassicism. And he's the last great neoclassicist. And as you can see, he has that interest in bed sheets. He has that interest in silhouette. He has that interest in grand people. And here is Homer being apostatized. And this is a kind of great allegory. And if we look at the details, we find, on the one hand, Virgil and Dante and so on and so forth. On the other hand, we find, let's have a look at the foreground, we find Poussin, we find Cardinal Richelieu, I think. Oh, no, it's not Cardinal Richelieu. It is, Philippe de Champagne, another French 17th century painter. And Ingres was deeply indebted to Poussin. Over on the other side, we find Racine and Molière and Voltaire. So it's an omnium gatherum of all the great poets and painters of history. But what it leads us into, let's have a look at the next. Here we are. There's Racine, the rather fat-faced person in profile. There's Molière, and this, at a lower level, is Voltaire. It leads us to realize that Ingres is, like Delacroix, interested in many different periods. Let's have a next of history. And here he is doing a fascinating painting On the one hand, he's deeply influenced by Raphael, and you can see he paints in the middle here Raphael's famous Sistine Madonna. But who is this in the foreground? This is Louis XIII, the father of Louis XIV, an early 17th century monarch in his regal robes, you see. So there is Ingres dealing with the 17th century, and there is the Raphael Sistine Madonna. Let's have a look at the next. Then he's interested in the 16th century. This painting represents Raphael, the divine painter of the high Renaissance, Raphael, with his lady love, the Fornarina, the baker's daughter. And obviously Raphael and the Fornarina are looking at a portrait, a very famous portrait in which the Fornarina appears not wearing all that much. And in the background is the Madonna della Sedia. And here is the very chair in which Pope Leo X sat, which appears in a Raphael portrait of Leo X. And here you see our Renaissance columns, and in the background a fine Renaissance palace. So Ingres is taking trouble to get the painting right. Let's have a look at the next in the High Renaissance. And then here is a scene of those famous lovers of Dante's, Paolo and Francesca, from the Inferno. And they're being discovered at their naughty little trinket games. And Ingres is trying to produce an interesting little medieval room with some medieval costume. And notice it's a sort of 15th century costume. It is, in fact, 1830s hairdo, however, and it's a very 1830s kiss. And this is an 1830s rather insinuating leg. And you notice, oh, drama of drama, she's let the book fall from her hand. She's so intoxicated by his lovemaking. And then there's a nice, let's say, late 13th, early 14th century cleric in the background, drawing, we hope, a 14th century sword, though it looks much more 16th century, in a very curious attempt at a 14th century room. And in fact, actually, Ingres does, but I can't show you because somebody else has a slide out, a very, very famous painting of Joan of Arc. So Ingres tries to do the 14th, 13th, 14th, 15th century. And then he tries to do the early 16th century. What on earth is going on here? This is not a doctor. This is Francis I kissing goodbye to Leonardo da Vinci. But you see, a French 16th century chair, the style of Francis I began to be a style which was much copied by furniture makers in the 1820s and the 1830s. So you see Ingres exploring the historical possibilities of period. Let's have a look at the next. And of course, Ingres wasn't alone. Here's another Ingres, and this time it's the late 16th century. This is Henry IV with the Spanish ambassador. And again, it is 16th century French architecture, late 16th century French costume with the ruffs, with the slashing, with the cloaks, with the high sort of headdresses, with their plumes and so on and so forth, with the doublet here. And that costume is got pretty well right. Of course, they're behaving in a somewhat 19th century kind of way, but if you paint in the 19th century, let's have a look at the next, you're liable to do 19th century gestures. It wasn't only Ingres and Delacroix. Another fascinating figure, Richard Parkes Bonnington, who was born in 1802 and died in 1828, thus died very young, an Englishman who worked largely in France and who was a close friend of Delacroix and who did some extraordinary watercolors, was also deeply interested, particularly in 16th century history. And here is Henry IV, Henry of Navarre, greeting the Spanish ambassador, and he's playing with his children. And what it indicates, you see, is that 19th century love of domesticity. And Louis Philippe always went out with an umbrella and played with his children. And Albert, Prince Consort, always went out with an umbrella and played with his children. And no doubt Frederick William of Prussia always played with his children and went out with an umbrella. And so in the 16th century, when you take a 16th century subject, you take a 19th century kind of subject, playing with your children even though you're a royal monarch. But on the other hand, you have to get your costume correct. And there again, the ruffs and doublets and hose and curtains, all very 16th century. And here is another one. This is Amy Robsart and the Earl of Leicester. Robin, Earl of Leicester, Queen Elizabeth I, great favorite, you remember. And it's always thought that Leicester murdered Amy Robsart because he married her and he wanted to be free of the encumbrance. And that is, in fact, is it not the subject of a novel by Sir Walter Scott called Kenilworth? Do you see? And there again, once more, Bonnington gives you a perfectly 19th century hound, and actually a rather 17th century balustrade, but 16th century costume. But what he's doing, he's exploring history once more. And for many a bourgeois family, it was a wonderful thing to explore the history of the past in a miscellaneous fashion through Delacroix, through Ingres, through Bonnington, and of course through Paul Roche. I would love to show you the great Paul Roche, which is in the National Gallery, London, which is of the execution of poor Lady Jane Grey, who was queen for 17 days. And she stands there, her neck bared upon the straw, and there's a sinister executioner, blindfolded, or not blindfolded, but, you know, with his face covered up, and all dressed in black, and he's sharpening his axe, and she is about to put her little neck, and she says it's only such a little neck. So you begin to see the 19th century, the absolute love of tremendous sentimental moments in the history of the past, which then painters do. And what is particularly important about Delacroix and, for instance, an American-English contemporary of Delacroix called C.R. Charles Robert Leslie, is that they paint these scenes with an increasingly archaeological passion of getting every detail right. You know, Lady Jane Grey is not allowed to wear a hairdo of the 1580s. She's got to wear a hairdo of the 1550s. And this is Cardinal Mazarin in his old age, with Cinq Mars. And there he is, you see, and he's lying in bed, he's about to croak, and he's leading all the rebels against the regime of Louis XIII to their doom. So you can see 17th century, 16th century. Here's another absolutely wonderful painting by Paul Roche. This is of, guess who? Oliver Cromwell looking at the corpse of Charles I. And let me tell you that this is a very, very accurate representation of the military uniform worn by Cromwell and his ironclads. And it is a very, very close portrait of Cromwell, complete with his famous warts. And Roche went and looked at the portraits by Samuel Cooper and Michael Wright in order to get it right, do you see? In order to really produce a historical document. And it goes with, of course, the fact that from about 1800 onwards, historians were relying much more deeply on documentation in writing their histories. Leopold von Ranke became a research historian. And people like Prescott and Motley in the United States all went, you see, to all the great archives of Simancas. Prescott went to the Simancas, you see, to get at the original documents, so that you knew about Philip II, you knew about Oliver Cromwell, and you knew about Francis I in a completely different way, and you knew about the children in the Tower. And here you see these lovely little morsels. You remember the two children in the Tower with their wicked uncle, Richard III? Famous in the Shakespeare play of Richard III, you know, Crookback Richard. And these tasty little morsels who were stifled in their beds by a horrible, wasn't the murderer, the assassin called Hubert. And there they are, and the assassins are just about to appear, and the dog is giving the alert, and they have some sort of consciousness, and one of them looks at us and says, "Oh, God, I don't want to die." And I've got indigestion too. And they're such sweet little creatures. And they're painted by Paul Roche, and they're painted in the most dinky costume of the late 15th century. And there's a big attempt, you see, at a late 15th century bed and 15th century sheets. I think the dog, however, belongs to a breed which was only introduced in the latter part of the 17th century. And so we have Roche, and we have Charles Robert Leslie, and this is poor Lady Jane Grey again, not about to be executed, but about to don the crown for her 17 days. So you can see the certain characters, let's have a look at the next, were very popular. But when I show you this, which is a scene from medieval German history, you sense a very substantial difference, don't you? And what is the nature of the difference? The nature of the difference is very easy to characterize. It is that Franz IV, P.F.O.R.R., who led a very short life, and who was one of the German Nazarene painters, and who came from Vienna to Rome, and died in about 1812, in his 20s, is no longer simply doing a medieval historical scene. He is using medieval manuscript illumination to direct his style. His style is as medieval as his subject matter. The color is very brilliant and undifferentiated. There's no deep interest in recession. Each figure is seen rather flatly and heraldically. And if we look at another of For's very, very few paintings, we get the same sense. Look at the marvelous azure here, and look at the absence of light. These people have the smallest shadows. Their contours are very, very simplified, and the areas of paint are very, very substantial, and indeed the background landscape looks very, very 15th century. We can look at one more For, and it's particularly beautiful and characteristic. And what is he really here returning to? He's returning to a Madonna, which of course is a religious scene, but he's returning to the style of the 15th century. And the style of the 15th century, not so much Italian in For, as German. And what happens in the 19th century is that the 15th century is rediscovered. Eventually Botticelli, Masaccio, eventually even Piero della Francesca. But first, probably, the Flemish 15th century. Roger van der Weyden, Hugo van der Goes, Jan van Eyck, Hans Memling, and so on. And then the earlier high Renaissance painters of Italy. Not so much the mature Raphael as the early Raphael, and not even necessarily was the early Raphael, but the immediate predecessors of Raphael, or contemporaries of Raphael. People like Francia, Piero di Cosimo, Francia Biggio, Fra Bartolomeo, and Perugino. And so For looks back to not just simply medieval subject matter, but medieval style. He's not alone. This German in Rome could be matched by William Blake in England. And I'm just showing you, because I'm not going to lecture on Blake for many reasons. One of the reasons is that if you wish really to have a good look at Blake, it is one of the few things you can do actually at UCSC. You go to the rare books room at UCSC and you ask to see the Blake collection. And you will not see lots of original Blakes, but you will see the most wonderful reproductions of Blake ever made. They're astonishingly faithful, and they're there in the greatest profusion. And I cannot recommend a greater afternoon's treat than for you to go up there and do just that, particularly if you're Blake enthusiasts. And you might well be, because this, you see, is one of the pages from the Songs of Innocence, and I want you to look at the way in which he disposes his illustrations. And he disposes them exactly as they might be disposed in the 12th or 13th century manuscript. Let's have a look at the next, which shows you a 12th, 13th century manuscript. And that wedding of text and illustration, the interweaving of the text into the illustration into the text, and the use of embellishment, the use of rhythmic embellishment. Let's have a look at the next, which is another Blake. Do you see? Is clearly copied from medieval manuscripts, and Blake knew his medieval manuscripts. As a young man, he'd been asked to go to Westminster Abbey to copy some of the medieval tombs, and he got into the chapter house, the monument room, and he saw lots of medieval manuscripts. And you see he stands right at the beginning of a fresh appreciation of medieval painting, which of course is largely seen through excellent manuscripts. And it gets right into Blake. Here's a Blake illustration to Dante's Inferno, and the actual shape, Dante's Paradise actually, the actual shape of this is like a medieval quatrefoil. And the relationship of figure to figure is based upon the sort of formal forms. So Blake in England is medievalizing in the way that For in Rome is medievalizing. Now, For was one of a whole group of German artists who proclaimed themselves to be the Brotherhood of St. Luke and became known as the Nazarenes, N-A-Z-A-R-E-N-E. They were known as Nazarenes because they had the impudence, coming from Germany, in Rome, to grow their hair long and to grow beards. And everybody thought, well, they look just like versions of Christ in medieval Renaissance painting. And of course, Christ was from Nazareth, so they became Nazarenes. It was their nickname, and it is the first opprobrious nickname applied to an art group, just as later on you have the Cubists and the Fauvists and so on. So the Nazarenes are quite interesting. And here is a portrait of young Franz IV by his friend Friedrich Overbeck. 4 died young. Overbeck carried on through a really rather long life, and one sometimes thinks perhaps Overbeck would have done better to die young too, because this is a perfectly beautiful painting, and Overbeck's paintings become less interesting and less beautiful. It is beautiful. It is, of course, microscopic in its attention to detail. It's painted with a kind of exquisite care. It's painted in exactly the opposite way that Delacroix paints. This is not a master of the loaded brush. This is a master of the single hair. Every little whisker upon that charming domestic cat, every little hair upon his hand, every little pleat. Notice his medieval costume and his medieval window, and then the leaded glass, and then the little medieval street that stretches out behind him, and the extremely medieval and very, very good girl who is darning his socks in the background. The totally medieval world, and the symbol of the Madonna, the lily, painted with a degree of precision and accuracy which takes you straight away back to late medieval northern portraits, to the world of Memling and Roger van der Weyden. And this is a Memling. And as you can see, Overbeck's portrait of 4 is so based upon 15th century practice, including the little landscape view in the background, including the attention to all the detail of the costume. Overbeck is a fascinating artist. He speaks to that continuous fascination which Germans have for Italy, and this is Germania and Italia. And you can be quite sure you know this is Germany and this is Italy, and there's an Italian scene behind, and quite clearly these creatures are not wearing 19th century costume, they are wearing late 15th century costume. And the landscape is not growing 19th century trees, it's growing late 15th century trees. And if you don't believe me, have a look at a Franciabigio, you see, or a Francia, which shows the deep indebtedness. Here is a painting by Chardin, who was another of the Nazarenes, and once again you see the medievalizing costume, the medievalizing approach to the landscape, the medievalizing approach to hair, to hands, to details, and that sense of revived symbolism, which is part of the same thing. And of course, what happened with the Nazarenes, they became fascinated by fresco. Fresco was the great language of medieval Italy, of early Renaissance and high Renaissance Italy. And the Nazarenes try to revive the art of fresco. And they do it in Rome in a very famous building, which is it's a casino of the family of the Massibi. And they're particularly interested, as I suggested, in late 15th century, in people like Ghirlandaio. And I've just shown you a Ghirlandaio fresco. And here you see is an Overbeck Christ with the wise and foolish virgins, and you can see how related that is to the frescoes of the late 15th century. Here's another Overbeck, the selling of Joseph into captivity. Here's another Overbeck, and you look at the way in which the architecture is done, you look at the kind of rather stiff and primitive attitude towards certain perspectival effects, you look at the pinks and the greys and the greens, and you say, yes, that might be a Pinturicchio, it might be a Cosimo Rosselli, it might be even a Signorelli, it is in fact an Overbeck. And eventually, here's a baptism scene, again, an attempt to revive the religious art. And finally, Overbeck, or in about 1840, when he returns to Germany, to Stuttgart and Munich, does art and religion. And here you see he copies absolutely directly Raphael, the Disputer. So the Nazarenes revive late medieval practice, and they revive fresco painting. And they have an English disciple called William Dyce. And William Dyce goes to Rome in the 1820s, where he meets some of the Nazarenes, comes back to England, and is a connecting link between the Nazarenes and the Pre-Raphaelites. And here is the Triumph of Religion, a fresco done by William Dyce. And you can see again, it is medievalizing and Italianizing. Here is a Mother and Child by Dyce, which is so obviously related to the world of the late 15th, early 16th century. And here's another Dyce religious painting in which his style becomes more complicated. Towards the end of his life, Dyce, who sets a standard at some stage for the Pre-Raphaelites, himself becomes influenced by the pre-Raphaelites themselves. And here's Titian's first lesson in color. What I want you to do is to look at the landscape background, because what emerges from the Nazarenes and is taken up by the pre-Raphaelites is an attention to absolute passion for visual detail. And you can see leaf after leaf, piece of bark after piece of bark, flower after flower, and you become conscious that out of that late medieval world, an aesthetic emerges which is enormously fortified by photography. And the passion, I think, which emerges in the 1840s and 1850s for Flemish painting, which is a passion which is shared by the Prince Consort and a great many others, is related to the appearance of the daguerreotype and has its fruition in the technique of the pre-Raphaelites. And here is another dice, and it shows you, I mean, you can see that as a photograph, can't you? It is George Herbert, a 17th century English divine at Bemerton. You actually see sort of something of the sort of loss of focus which some early photographs have in the distance, and then the tight, startling tightness of the photograph. Well, I'm now showing you a typical, indeed quintessential pre-Raphaelite painting. And it's not by one of the great names of pre-Raphaelitism, which you all know. It's by Arthur Hughes, who was born in 1830 and died in 1915, a very great age, and who was a minor pre-Raphaelite and joined the movement in the 1850s. It is called Home from Sea, and it is worth thinking about the plot for a moment. The young man comes home from sea to discover that his parents have died and is inconsolable in an English country churchyard. It is a scene which is at once immensely domestic and immensely harrowing. It is a scene upon which Arthur Hughes lavishes several things. He lavishes all his capacity for sentimentality, which is considerable. He lavishes all his feeling for beauty, which is also considerable. He's a sweet young man, and she's a sad young lady with a very, very delicate complexion. And he lavishes all his passion for brilliance of color. You have rarely seen a painting which is more projective in its brilliance of green and brilliance of blue. And you look at the chestnut locks, and you look at the red tiles, and you look at the green, and greener green was never seen. And then you look at the last thing, which is the lavishing of infinite pains of craftsmanship on every leaf of ivy, every twig, every daisy, every blade of grass, every hair, every movement on the pale temples of that poor young lassie as her little purple veins beat behind her pale pink cheeks. And that desire for exactitude is really something which the pre-Raphaelites inherit from a very peculiar view of history. And the pre-Raphaelites, whom we'll deal with on Friday, are fascinating because they illustrate the mid-19th century dilemma of medievalism versus modernism. And it is interesting, in England, medievalism sort of wins out to some extent on modernism. In France, modernism wins out on medievalism. And that is, I think, very largely due to the very peculiar personality of many of the pre-Raphaelites, but in particular the quite extraordinary quality of that strange drug taker, that odd poet, that exhumer of dead wives and dead poetry, Dante, Gabriel, Rossetti. Thank you.